Queen Victoria once looked at her first cousin, sighed, and wrote in her diary, "Her size is fearful. It is really a misfortune." The cousin in question was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. She was large. She was loud. She was perpetually overdrawn. She showed up late to everything and stayed too long at all of it. She spent money she didn't have on parties, dresses, holidays, and charities, sometimes in that order, sometimes all at once. And she was, by a very wide margin, the most beloved royal in Britain after the Queen herself. This is the story of how a woman dismissed her entire life for the way she looked, built a legacy that still exists today. It involves a brutal Victorian marriage market, a husband who was broke and handsome in roughly equal measure, a spectacular financial collapse, 2 years of Italian exile, and a daughter who became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. It also involves a lot of food. We will get to that. To understand why Mary Adelaide was the size she was, you need to understand where she came from. She was born on November 27, 1833, in Hanover, Germany, the youngest child of Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, the 7th son of King George III, and Princess Augusta of Hesse-Kassel. Her father was 59 years old when she was born. Her mother was 36. The family was, by all accounts, surprised. The Hanoverian royal family had a well-documented tendency toward large builds. George III's sons were, as a group, conspicuously corpulent. The Prince Regent, later George IV, became so large in later life that contemporary cartoonists barely needed to exaggerate. Mary Adelaide's father, Adolphus, was no exception to the family pattern. Mary Adelaide inherited this physique completely and without apology. She was large from childhood and grew larger as she aged. By the time she entered society in her late teens, contemporaries were already noticing. When she was 18 and visiting Brussels with her mother, King Leopold of the Belgians, who was notably extremely tall and thin, wrote to his niece Queen Victoria about their encounter. His assessment was not kind. "Poor Mary, such a beautiful child, is grown out of all compass, to my great regret." Leopold, who is all longitude, was her neighbor and looked quite alarmed. By the time she was in her mid-20s, she weighed approximately 15 stone, around 210 pounds. By the peak of her later life, contemporary accounts put the figure considerably higher. She was also, it should be noted, genuinely beautiful in other respects. She was tall, with ash-blonde wavy hair, dark blue eyes, and what observers described as a good complexion. She moved with what was repeatedly called natural grace, which is a thing people say about large people who carry themselves well, and in her case seems to have been genuinely true. She had a beautiful mezzo-soprano voice. She was an excellent mimic and loved the opera and theater. None of which made her thin, and in Victorian royal circles, that was considered a serious problem. Victorian royal marriage operated on extremely specific rules. You had to marry someone of royal blood. British aristocracy, however wealthy, did not qualify. You were expected to be a certain age, a certain size, and, ideally, in possession of a useful income. Mary Adelaide checked the royal blood box. She checked almost nothing else. Her personal allowance was £3,000 per year, modest by royal standards. She refused to consider anyone who would require her to leave Britain. She was large in a world where large women were considered unmarriageable. And by the time the family began seriously looking for candidates, she was already pushing 30. The search was, by all accounts, dispiriting. Prince Oscar of Sweden visited in 1856 with what everyone hoped were matrimonial intentions. He visited several times. He did not propose. He left. The King of Sardinia proposed. He had recently been widowed and was looking for a Protestant wife. Mary Adelaide declined. She was, she said, deeply Protestant herself. She put it more directly than that. My heart is truly Protestant. At 25, with the parade of unsuitable candidates continuing, she confessed to her brother. Gloomy dreams of an old maidish future, coupled with a homely and dreary position. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Clarendon, summed up the situation with characteristic Victorian bluntness. Alas, no German prince will venture on so vast an undertaking. Even the Dutch Queen Sophie weighed in, comparing Mary Adelaide's situation to her unmarried aunts. Poor Mary, I pity her, and no doubt she will end as her aunt did, a child and no husband. It was, in short, a Victorian marriage market catastrophe. She was royal enough to exclude almost everyone, and not thin enough, young enough, or rich enough to attract the ones who remained. The solution arrived in 1865, found by the Prince of Wales and his wife, Princess Alexandra, while visiting Vienna. At the Austrian court, they met a young officer, Prince Francis of Teck, a member of a minor branch of the Württemberg royal family. Francis's situation was slightly complicated. His father had contracted a morganatic marriage, a marriage to someone of lower rank. This meant Francis had no succession rights to the Württemberg throne, and his rank was Serene Highness rather than Royal Highness. He was, in the hierarchy of European royalty, several steps below Mary Adelaide. He was also, by multiple contemporary accounts, spectacularly handsome, described as the most handsome man at the Austrian court. The Prince of Wales invited him to England. Francis arrived. He and Mary Adelaide met on March 7, 1866. Less than a month later, he proposed in Kew Gardens. She accepted immediately. Her mother wrote, "I am happy to say I feel sure of dear Mary's future happiness." Mary Adelaide herself wrote, "How happy I am, and with what confiding hope I can look forward to a future of bright promise, as he is." They were married on June 12, 1866, at St. Anne's Church in Kew. She was 33 years old. He was 28. She was a granddaughter of George III. He was the product of a morganatic marriage with no throne prospects. It was, from a dynastic standpoint, an unequal match, but by all accounts, a happy one. Mary Adelaide immediately requested that Queen Victoria grant Francis the title of Royal Highness. The Queen declined. She granted him the lesser title of Highness in 1887 as part of her Golden Jubilee generosities, 21 years later. The Tecks settled initially at Kensington Palace and later moved to White Lodge in Richmond Park, a substantial country house provided by Queen Victoria on permanent loan. Their family grew quickly. In 1867, their first child was born at Kensington Palace, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known always as May. She was followed by 3 sons, Adolphus, Francis, and Alexander, when Mary Adelaide was 40 years old. White Lodge became the center of a household that observers described in strikingly consistent terms: warm, chaotic, affectionate, and perpetually short of money. Francis and Mary Adelaide were, by all contemporary accounts, genuinely devoted to each other. This was not, in the world of Victorian royal marriages, guaranteed. It was also not especially helpful for their finances, since 2 people who love each other and both enjoy spending money tend to spend more together than either would separately. Francis was handsome, charming, and somewhat temperamental. He had a tendency toward depression that became more pronounced as he aged. He was also, like his wife, constitutionally unsuited to economy. Mary Adelaide adored him. Their marriage was, by the standards of an era when royal unions were primarily diplomatic arrangements, unusual. They actually liked each other. They had children they clearly enjoyed. They had a social life that was genuinely merry rather than performatively so. May, their eldest daughter, later remembered her childhood as warm, if financially precarious. May herself was her mother's opposite in temperament: quiet, self-contained, studious, and reserved. Where Mary Adelaide filled every room she entered, May was the one who observed carefully from the corner. She acted as her mother's unofficial secretary from her late teens, helping manage the charity correspondence, draft replies, and classify applications in the ledgers. She learned organization and duty from her mother, even when the personal styles could not have been more different. After her marriage, Mary Adelaide threw herself into the role of society hostess with a completeness that was, for her budget, catastrophic. White Lodge became one of the most active social centers in Victorian London. There were dinners, garden parties, and musical evenings. Mary Adelaide loved music. She sang mezzo-soprano and had a good ear, and her musical evenings drew genuine performers. She loved the theater and the opera and attended both frequently. She loved good food and understood it, which contributed to the table at White Lodge having a reputation considerably above what the household income could strictly support. She had expensive tastes across every category: food, clothes, entertainment, hospitality, and charitable giving. The problem was that she could only actually afford the charitable giving, and she was doing that too. The parties were frequent and elaborate. The guest lists were long. The bills were longer. What made the social life distinctive was not its scale. Plenty of Victorian aristocrats entertained at that level, but its character. Mary Adelaide was genuinely interested in the people at her parties. She was not performing hospitality. She was actually glad you were there. Observers noted consistently that she had an unusual capacity to make each person she spoke to feel that they were the most interesting person in the room. She was also completely unpunctual. This drove Queen Victoria, who was obsessively precise about time, absolutely mad. Mary Adelaide was late to things in the way that some people are consistently late to everything. Not out of carelessness exactly, but because she was always doing 17 things at once, and each of them ran slightly over. She was also chronically late with letters, with accounts, and with the management of correspondence. She compensated for this by being, when she did arrive, impossible not to like. Contemporary descriptions circle around the same qualities: warmth, humor, and directness, a genuine interest in people that extended well past the usual royal condescension toward commoners. She remembered names, she remembered circumstances, she followed up. Mary Adelaide received £5,000 per year from Parliament as a princess carrying out royal duties. Her mother, the Duchess of Cambridge, supplemented this with approximately £4,000 per year. This gave the Tecks a combined income of around £9,000 annually. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. The household at White Lodge ran at a consistent deficit. The parties cost more than they should have. The clothes cost more than they should have. The food, and the Tecks kept a generous table, cost more than it should have. The charitable donations, which were substantial, cost more than could be justified by any reasonable budget. Francis had debts of his own that predated the marriage. For years, the situation was managed by not being looked at too closely. Creditors were patient, the royal connection helped. Requests to Queen Victoria for additional funds were made and generally declined. The Queen was sympathetic, but had her own views about the Teck's financial management. By 1883, the situation had become impossible. The creditors were no longer patient, the debts were no longer ignorable, and Queen Victoria, who had watched the crisis for years, made it known that the family needed to leave the country and live more cheaply elsewhere. The Tecks packed up 4 children and a reduced household staff and departed for the continent. They traveled initially under the pseudonym Count and Countess of von Hohenstein, a gesture toward discretion that lasted until Mary Adelaide encountered a hotel that was not living up to her standards. She produced her real title. The service improved. Florence, in 1883, was, for the British upper classes in financial difficulty, something of an established destination. The cost of living was lower. The art was extraordinary. The society was international and relatively accepting of people whose English situation was, as the phrase went, complicated. The Tecks settled into the Villa i Cedri, later moving to other accommodation. They traveled the European courts. Francis had family connections throughout Germany and Austria, and Mary Adelaide's status as a granddaughter of George III and first cousin of the reigning queen made her welcome in many places. They were also, despite the supposed purpose of the exile, not especially economical in Florence. Mary Adelaide's style of living adjusted somewhat downward. She was, after all, working with a genuinely reduced household, but she remained Mary Adelaide, sociable, generous, and completely constitutionally incapable of doing anything quietly. In 1885, with the debts sufficiently restructured that return was possible, the family came home. They returned to White Lodge, to Kensington Palace, and to the social world Mary Adelaide had always inhabited. She was 51 years old and showed no sign of slowing down. Return from Florence marked a shift. Mary Adelaide was still a society hostess. That never stopped. But after 1885, the charity work moved to the center of everything she did. The scale of it is worth pausing on. She became patron to over 100 organizations. These were not nominal patronages, a name on a letterhead to lend credibility and nothing more. She opened all her own charity correspondence. She personally assessed each application. She and May maintained detailed ledgers, classifying every request and tracking what had been done about each one. When she gave her name, she gave also her time, energy, and thought. The most significant patronage was Barnardo's, the organization founded in 1866 to provide shelter, education, and care for destitute children. It was a relatively new organization, working in the most difficult urban environments. Mary Adelaide gave it her name and her active presence. She attended events, sold goods at bazaars, and brought crowds. She was also a patron of the London Homeopathic Hospital, a cause she had inherited from her mother and continued throughout her life, using her public presence to draw attention and donations. The British public knew all of this, and unlike the distant ceremonial appreciation Victorians were supposed to feel, what they felt for Mary Adelaide was something warmer and more specific. Next to Queen Victoria herself, she was the most popular member of the royal family. When she appeared in public, crowds gathered, not because they were supposed to, but because they actually wanted to be there. They called her the People's Princess, a century before Diana. In 1891, Mary Adelaide turned her energy to her daughter's future. May was 24, intelligent, well-educated, and suitable by every measure for a significant marriage. Mary Adelaide had views about which marriage that should be. The Prince of Wales's eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was second in line to the throne. Queen Victoria approved of May as a candidate, British-born, royally descended, and serious and dutiful in a way that Eddie perhaps needed. The engagement was announced in December 1891. Mary Adelaide was triumphant. Her daughter was engaged to the second heir to the British throne. 6 weeks later, Eddie was dead. He had caught a cold at Sandringham over Christmas. By early January, he had pneumonia. On January 14, 1892, at 28 years old, he was gone. May's wedding bouquet of orange blossoms was placed on his coffin. Mary Adelaide was at Sandringham for the death. She helped her daughter through the immediate aftermath. She was also the one who helped maintain the connection with Eddie's younger brother, George, who had now moved into the line of succession. George proposed to May on April 29, 1893. Mary Adelaide had guided her daughter from a dead prince to a living one who would become king. They married on July 6, 1893. They became George V and Queen Mary. Their granddaughter was Elizabeth II. Mary Adelaide continued her charity work, her social life, and her determined engagement with every cause she believed in through the mid-1890s. She was heavier than ever, and her health was beginning to reflect the weight of a life lived at full throttle. In October 1897, she fell seriously ill. An emergency operation was performed at White Lodge. On October 27, 1897, Mary Adelaide, Duchess of Teck, died in the house she had lived in for decades. She was 63. Her death was widely mourned. Queen Victoria, who had spent the better part of 30 years being exasperated by her cousin, mourned her genuinely. So did the British public. So did the charities. Barnardo's, which she had been the first royal to champion and which still operates today, has had an unbroken line of royal patrons from Mary Adelaide through to the present day. The tradition she started in 1885 has not stopped. The woman they called Fat Mary, who was told by a foreign secretary that no German prince would take her on, who spent money she didn't have on causes she believed in, who showed up late to everything and made up for it by being impossible to ignore, who guided her daughter from a broken engagement to the British throne, who invented the People's Princess and was largely forgotten in favor of the woman who came after. Her name was Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, and the things she started are still running. Thank you for watching. If this story surprised you, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel. I want to leave you with one question. Mary Adelaide was mocked her entire life for her weight. She was told repeatedly she was unmarriageable, unsuitable, too much. She ignored all of it and built something lasting. What would that look like today? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. See you next time.